Two planes carrying 349 people speed towards each other in the evening skies above Delhi. In one of those planes, 5 pilots sit at the controls, making preparations to land. In the other, 3 pilots are climbing along their departure route. An air traffic controller sits at the top of a tower, watching 2 blips on his screen draw closer together. What do these things have in common? The people immediately in charge of the outcome, those sitting in the pointy ends of these structures, also sit at the pointy end of a vast and complex infrastructure that undergirds their actions. All of these systems and infrastructures make up the foundations for the pyramid of aviation safety, on top of which pilots and air traffic controllers sit. What you're about to see is the shocking story of what happens when the foundations of this pyramid are rotten. On the evening of November 12, 1996, 289 passengers and 23 crew members stepped on board a Saudi Arabian Airlines Boeing 747 in Delhi, India. They were bound for Dhahran International Airport in Saudi Arabia, a 4-hour journey. Many of the passengers were migrant workers headed for construction and hospitality jobs in the Gulf. Flight 763 was the beginning of a long journey for them. As they settled into their seats, a few hundred kilometers to the northwest, another group of passengers was descending towards Delhi, getting ready for a much shorter trip to the Indian capital. Most of the 27 passengers on board Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 1907 were traders preparing for a shopping trip to Delhi. Their plan was to buy up as many cheap textiles as they could and fill the plane up with them for the return journey to Kazakhstan a few days later. For several strange reasons, which we'll explore in a moment, these two sets of passengers would come closer together than ever intended. But at least initially, as the Kazakh plane began its descent and the Saudi plane was loaded with passengers and baggage, all was normal. In command of Saudi Flight 763 was 45-year-old Captain Khalid al-Shubaili. With just short of 10,000 hours of flying time, he was a highly experienced pilot. He had flown this route many times before and was familiar with the peculiarities of Delhi's airspace at the time. Sitting to his right was Nazir Khan, an American captain who would be acting as first officer on this flight. He was 44 years old and was also very experienced, with more than 7,000 hours of flying time under his belt. Behind the two pilots was flight engineer Ahmed Idris. At 33 years old, he was the least experienced member of this flight crew, with just over 3,000 hours of total experience. On this evening, these 3 pilots and the 309 passengers and crew would fall victim to a complex web of systemic inadequacies completely beyond their control. The foundations of the pyramid, which had supported their safe passage through the skies for all these years, were about to reveal its fatal flaws. Once the pilots had completed their checklist and all of the passengers had boarded, Flight 763 pushed back from the gate. The countdown to disaster had now begun. The time was 20 past 6 in the evening. As the Saudi jet pushed back, Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 1907 was in the middle of its descent towards the airport. It was now 19 nautical miles away, or about 170 kilometers. Along with 27 passengers, there were 10 crew members on board. Even though this particular aircraft, a Soviet-designed plane called the Ilyushin Il-76, was just 4 years old, the technology on board was ancient. Of the 10 crew members on board this flight, 5 of them were in the cockpit. To accommodate all of them, the cockpit was split into 2 decks, an upper deck and a lower deck. On the upper deck, sitting in the left-hand seat, was 44-year-old Captain Alexander Chirapanov. He was joined to his right by 37-year-old First Officer Ermek Zangarov. Behind him was 50-year-old flight engineer Alexander Chuprov and 41-year-old radio operator Igor Rep. Finally, sitting on the lower deck in what might be called an original glass cockpit was navigator Zahanbek Yusupov. This was an experienced crew. Even the least experienced pilot, the first officer, had almost 7,000 hours of flying experience. But there was one area in which the crew was all badly lacking: their level of English. This fact, combined with some quirks of the aircraft they were flying, would lead to disastrous consequences as the aircraft neared Delhi. 6:33 p.m., the controller cleared Flight 1907 down to 18,000 feet. The radio operator acknowledged this clearance. As per the captain's instructions, he would be handling all ATC communications for the approach and landing into Delhi. It was a rather unusual approach. In fact, every plane departing and arriving into Delhi flew an unusual route. In 1996, Indian airspace was split about 50 between military and civilian control. There was a strict divide between the two airspaces, with civilian aircraft being forbidden from flying in military airspace, and military aircraft being forbidden from flying in civilian airspace. Delhi's airport was particularly heavily affected by this divide. The airport had only been handed over to civilian control the previous year, and almost all of the airspace surrounding it was still controlled by the military. The only way civilian aircraft could get in or out of the airport was along one narrow corridor. This stretched from the airport out to a waypoint called Lunker, 330 kilometers to the west. It was this corridor that Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 1907 was now flying along on its way into Delhi. It was also the corridor along which Saudi Airlines Flight 763 would be flying as they departed the airport. If it strikes you as bad design that departing and arriving aircraft fly on the same path, you're not alone. Controllers at Delhi had been protesting this system for years, but nothing had been done about it. We're about to see the consequences of this in action. At 6:33 p.m., just as the Kazakh pilots received their descent clearance, the Saudi pilots lined their massive 747 up with runway 28 and began their takeoff roll. A few moments later, they and their 309 passengers and crew were airborne, climbing out over the densely populated city of Delhi. It was a good day for flying. The winds were relatively calm, and while there was some smog low to the ground, the visibility was much better up in the air. After takeoff, the crew of Flight 763 switched their radios over to Delhi approach control and made first contact. The controller VK Dutta was responsible for all departing and arriving traffic in and out of the airport. He identified the Saudi aircraft on his radar and instructed them to climb to 10,000 feet initially. Much like the pilots in the Kazakh jet, Dutta was using antiquated technology for his work. The kind of radar he had was not state-of-the-art since the 1960s. It didn't get sent any information from the aircraft electronically. Rather, a radar dish at the airport sent out a signal in all directions and picked up when the signal was reflected off an aircraft. As a result of this, it could only tell the position of planes and not their altitude or even which aircraft they were. Dutta had to take the pilot's word for it when they gave him this information. For more than a decade, there had been plans in place to install a modern radar system, but bureaucratic forces had stymied the installation of this technology. So, sitting on top of this ancient infrastructure, keeping passenger planes separated at an airport which handled a takeoff and landing every 4 minutes, was one man. One man who had to work with one piece of information per aircraft, and who had to do it all in one narrow corridor. Because there was only one route in and out of the airport, the only way the controller could keep planes separated was to keep them at different altitudes. The international standard for this vertical separation is 1,000 feet. The controller's plan was to keep the inbound Kazakh plane at a higher altitude and to let the Saudi plane pass beneath it. As the Saudi 747 continued its climb to 10,000 feet, the Kazakh plane was descending through 23,000 feet on its way down to 18,000. It was just over 70 nautical miles from the airport at this point, or 130 kilometers. The radio operator sitting behind the pilots reported their position to air traffic control. The controller cleared the flight down to 15,000 feet and asked them to report when they had reached this altitude. The radio operator acknowledged this, and the flight continued its descent. As both aircraft were now tuned into the same radio frequency, the pilots in each plane were able to hear the transmissions from the other plane and their conversations with air traffic control. Listening out for other aircraft in order to build a mental picture of what's going on in the airspace is a key way by which pilots can maintain their situational awareness. This provides an added layer of protection for planes, especially in the busy airspace around airports. In the cockpit of the Kazakh plane, a conversation now took place between the radio operator and the pilots. They needed to convert the altitude the controller had given them, 15,000 feet, into meters. This was because most of the altimeters in their cockpit showed altitude in meters, including the first officer's altimeter. This was important because he was the one flying the plane. Only the captain's altimeter and the navigator's altimeter on the lower deck showed altitude in feet. The radio operator checked his conversion chart and told the pilots that 15,000 feet was equal to 4,570 meters. They acknowledged this and continued their descent. 1 minute after being cleared to 15,000 feet, the Saudi pilots reported to air traffic control that they were level at 10,000 feet and asked for a higher altitude. The controller acknowledged this and cleared them to climb to 14,000 feet. Dutta intended to let the Saudi plane pass beneath the Kazakh plane, maintaining the standard separation of 1,000 feet. On board the Kazakh plane, the radio operator had been checking his conversion chart to ensure the correct altitude conversion. As he leaned forward to view the altimeter, he confirmed that the plane was descending to the proper altitude. However, the Kazakh crew didn't seem to grasp the critical importance of maintaining their assigned altitude. As the Kazakh plane descended through 16,000 feet, it was already dangerously close to the Saudi aircraft. The Saudi plane, now climbing through 11,000 feet, continued on its course. At 6:35 p.m., the Kazakh radio operator reported they had reached 15,000 feet and were 46 nautical miles from the airport. But in reality, they were still descending through 16,400 feet. This discrepancy likely arose because the radio operator was guessing their altitude, unable to clearly see the altimeter. The controller instructed the Kazakh flight to maintain 15,000 feet and warned them of the Saudi 747, which was 10 miles away. The Kazakh crew began searching for the Saudi jet, but couldn't see it due to clouds. As the Kazakh plane continued descending, the Saudi pilots, unaware of the Kazakh plane's true altitude, relied on the controller's information. At 6:39 p.m., the Kazakh radio operator suddenly shouted, "Hold the level!" The plane was now descending through 14,000 feet. The captain asked, "What level were we given?" The flight engineer yelled, "Maintain." And the radio operator clarified, "Keep to level 150, don't descend." The captain disconnected the autopilot and increased engine power to stop the descent, but it was too late. At 6:39 p.m. and 57 seconds, the left wing of the Kazakh plane struck the Saudi jet's left engines. The impact caused a massive explosion, tearing the aircraft apart. Both planes plummeted to the ground, killing all 349 people on board. This tragedy, the worst mid-air collision in history, highlighted severe flaws in aviation safety infrastructure. The aftermath of this disaster led to significant changes. In 1999, India became the second country to mandate the use of traffic collision avoidance systems, TCAS, in its airspace. Other nations followed suit, making TCAS standard worldwide. Delhi's airport and Indian airspace underwent much-needed upgrades, including modern radar systems and improved civilian control. Today, 500,000 people safely fly in India daily. This tragedy demonstrated that while pilot errors played a role, the inadequate infrastructure and outdated technology were the root causes of the disaster. The incident served as a wake-up call, leading to essential improvements and ensuring safer skies for everyone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, like, share, and subscribe our tiny channel to make it big in less time. See you soon for the next episode.